A millionaire visits his ex's humble home, and what he discovers there makes him break down in tears. The car stopped in the middle of the road, not because it broke down, not because it ran out of gas. Daniel Whitfield simply took his foot off the accelerator, eased the vehicle onto the shoulder of the dirt road, and sat there for almost 3 minutes, his hands still on the wheel, his eyes fixed on the dust rising slowly at the far end of the road. He was 43 years old. He owned 3 companies. He had a penthouse in Manhattan with a view of Central Park, a ranch in the Texas Hill Country he barely visited, and a bank account most people couldn't imagine even if they tried. He had assistants, drivers, lawyers, and a calendar that rarely left room for the unexpected. And yet here he was, parked on a dirt road that smelled of wet grass and warm earth in rural East Texas, almost 600 miles from everything he'd built, because of a text message 3 lines long. He'd received it 2 days earlier, from a number he hadn't recognized at first. When he opened it, he saw the name Tom Bradley, a man he'd known for more than 20 years, the son of a neighboring farmer, someone who crossed his path now and then at some regional event, whenever he still passed through those parts. The message read simply, "Daniel, I know you're coming next week to sign the papers on your dad's land. Claire's still living out here in a little house at the end of Hollow Creek Road. Figured you should know. Nothing else." Daniel stared at the message for a long time, then closed his phone and went to bed. He woke up at 3 in the morning with the dark ceiling of his bedroom above him, and the feeling that something was lodged in the middle of his chest that wasn't his heart, but behaved exactly like it. He called the office early and rearranged his calendar. He told his assistant he'd be arriving in East Texas a day earlier to handle a personal matter. She didn't ask anything. She never did. The next day, after signing the preliminary documents at the county clerk's office in town, instead of heading back to the hotel, Daniel took the rental car, turned off the GPS, and drove the route he still knew by heart, even after 13 years. And now here he was, parked with the engine running and the air conditioning blowing cold against his face, staring at the road as if it could tell him whether this was a good idea. He took a breath, let off the parking brake, and kept driving. Hollow Creek Road was exactly as he remembered, narrow, uneven, lined with barbed wire fencing on one side and tall grass on the other. The sun hit straight on at that hour of the afternoon, the kind of sun rural Texas doesn't apologize for, the kind that comes through the window and warms your arm resting on the door even with the glass rolled up. In the distance, a white egret crossed the field slowly, as if it had no appointment to keep with time. Daniel knew every curve of that road. He'd ridden it on a bicycle when he was 15, then on a motorcycle, then on foot on nights that needed nothing more than a full moon and the certainty that someone was waiting at the end of it. He made the last turn and saw the house. He stopped the car slowly, as if noise itself would be an offense. It was small, smaller than he remembered, or maybe memory had exaggerated its size over the years. The walls were weathered clapboard with visible cracks, patched here and there with mismatched paint in a repair that hadn't quite worked. The tin roof sagged slightly on the left side, where a length of PVC guttering hung on by a wire. A wooden gate separated the small front yard from the road, with a climbing vine of yellow flowers winding up the post and spilling its blossoms as if it were the one thing that didn't know the house needed looking after. There was a clothesline to the right with laundry hanging. Small items, children's clothes, a woman's white blouse, a few socks, everything clean, everything arranged with the kind of care that doesn't need money, just attention. Daniel turned off the engine. That was when he saw the little girl. She stood in the doorway holding a faded stuffed rabbit against her chest, dark hair loose over her shoulders, big eyes watching the car without fear and without excessive curiosity, just the particular seriousness of small children who haven't yet learned to pretend they aren't paying attention. She looked about 5, maybe a little older. Daniel stepped out of the car slowly. He stood outside for a moment, as if he needed permission from something or someone he couldn't quite name. Then he opened the gate carefully and walked into the yard, his shoes pressing into the packed dirt, swept clean, the kind of yard someone bothers to sweep every single day even with no one to impress. The little girl didn't move, just kept watching him with her wide brown eyes, the stuffed rabbit tucked under her chin. Daniel stopped about 10 feet from the door and said, in a voice that came out lower than he intended, "Good afternoon. Is your mum home?" The girl didn't answer right away. She kept staring at him with that seriousness. Then she turned her head slightly toward the house and called out, "Mum, there's a man here." The voice that came from inside sounded like something pulled out of a drawer after a long time, still carrying the same scent it used to. "Tell him to wait a second, Lily." Daniel stood in the yard. The sun beat down on his back. A hen wandered slowly near the fence. At the back of the small lot, there was a modest vegetable garden, tomatoes, collard greens, and what looked like a patch of basil, all tended by the same hand that had swept the yard and hung the laundry. Then Claire appeared in the doorway. He couldn't speak. She froze for a moment too. She held a dish towel in her hands, halfway through folding it, and her hands stopped mid-motion. But her face didn't change the way he'd expected. It didn't go pale. It didn't show shock. There was only a pause, brief, like someone recognizing something they'd expected to find sooner or later. Her hair was the same dark shade, now pulled into a simple bun with a plastic clip. Her face had changed the way faces change when they go through a great deal without anyone to share the weight. It wasn't exactly tiredness. It was a kind of steadiness that tiredness leaves behind when it finally moves on and the person is still standing. She wore a plain short-sleeved blouse and a printed skirt washed so many times the color had softened into something like an antique. She was beautiful. Daniel realized he'd thought that before he could stop himself. Claire came down the step and said in a voice calmer than the silence between them, "Daniel." It wasn't a question, wasn't an exclamation, just the acknowledgement of a fact. His name in her mouth sounded like something he'd forgotten in a drawer somewhere and found again without looking for it. He managed to say, "Claire, I'm sorry to show up like this, without calling first." She looked at him for a moment, then glanced at the girl still standing in the doorway with the stuffed rabbit, watching them both with the attention of someone who knows something important is happening, even without fully understanding what. "Come in," Claire said. "Let me get you something to drink." Daniel stepped inside. It was small on the inside, too, a room that served as both living room and kitchen, separated only by a makeshift wooden counter, a table with 3 mismatched chairs, a wooden bookshelf holding a few paperbacks, a Bible, a decorative tin, and a small battery-powered radio. The floor was stained concrete, worn down to a lighter shade in the well-traveled spots. The walls had once been painted white and were now somewhere between yellow and nothing at all. But there were wildflowers in a glass jar on the table, the kind that grow along the roadside and nobody plants, because they don't need an invitation. There was an embroidered cloth draped over the shelf, the cross-stitch work of many patient hours. There was a child's drawing taped to the wall, a sun with a face and clouds with arms, done in crayon on notebook paper. The house was poor, the way poverty looks when the person living in it refuses to be defined by it. Daniel stood near the table, not feeling entitled to sit without being asked. The girl had followed him in and now sat on the floor with the stuffed rabbit, working on a wooden puzzle whose pieces had gone smooth from years of little hands. Claire came back with a glass of lemonade and a plate with 2 slices of homemade bread and a piece of cheese. "It's not much," she said, setting it on the table. "It's more than I deserve," he answered, and realized he meant it without calculation, something that rarely happened to him anymore. She gestured to the chair. They both sat. For a moment neither spoke. The girl made the small clicking sounds of puzzle pieces on the floor. Outside a bird sang twice and stopped. It was Claire who broke the silence. "Tom told you." It wasn't a question. "Yes," Daniel said. She nodded slightly as if confirming something to herself. "Figured he'd do it sooner or later. He's too good a man to stay quiet." Daniel looked at her. "You knew he might tell me." "I knew you were coming to settle your father's papers, and I knew Tom would never let it pass without saying something. He always believed we needed to work this out, don't you?" She picked up the glass of lemonade she'd poured for herself and drank a little before answering. "I think there are things time already worked out, Daniel, one way or another." He kept looking at her, then at the girl on the floor, then back at Claire, and asked, "How long have you lived in this house?" She answered without looking away. 9 years, since my mother passed and I inherited the land. I built the house little by little, with what I had. You built it? She gave something that wasn't quite a smile but carried the same weight. Me and Frank Coleman, my neighbor down the road. He helped with the framing. The rest was me. Daniel glanced at the cracked wall, the low ceiling, the fixed-pane window that had been replaced at some point with a screen tacked on with nails. He said, before he could stop himself, "Claire, you shouldn't have had to live like this. If I'd known—" She raised her hand slightly, a gentle motion, no aggression in it but final. "Don't start there, okay?" He fell quiet. For a moment, there was only the sound of the puzzle. Then the little girl looked up from the floor, studied Daniel with those wide, serious eyes and asked, "Are you friends with my mom?" Daniel looked at her. There was something in that small face he couldn't quite place yet. Not in that moment, not yet, but it stirred something in his chest, an unease that wasn't discomfort. It was recognition. "I was, once. A long time ago," he answered. The girl studied him for another second, then went back to the puzzle with the seriousness of someone who had more urgent matters at hand. Claire looked at her daughter with an expression it took Daniel a few seconds to understand. It wasn't worry, it was attention, the kind of look that only exists when someone loves something more than they love their own peace of mind. "This is Lily," Claire said. "She's 5. Daniel nodded. "She's beautiful." "She is," Claire said simply. And a pause followed that carried weight. Daniel drank the lemonade, tart and cold and rich in a way restaurant lemonade back in New York never managed to be. He ate a piece of the bread, soft, smelling faintly of wood smoke. He was hungry, he realized, in a way that wasn't only physical. They talked for a while about small things, how the town had changed, the drought that had hit the region 2 years back, Lily's school 6 miles away, how Claire biked her there every morning when it wasn't raining, and how Frank Coleman's neighbor drove her in his old truck, held together by faith and duct tape whenever it poured. Daniel listened with an attention that wasn't usual for him. In business meetings, he always listened with part of his mind already forming answers, calculations, counter-proposals. He listened to Claire with his mind completely still, as if every word she said filled the whole space available. At some point, Lily fell asleep on the floor with the rabbit clutched to her chest, the puzzle still unfinished beside her. Claire got up without a sound, lifted her daughter with the practiced ease of someone who'd done it 1,000 times, and carried her to the room behind a curtain of faded fabric at the back of the house. She came back a minute later, sat down again, and looked at him. "What did you come here looking for, Daniel?" He hadn't prepared an answer for that, which was unusual. Daniel Whitfield always prepared answers. He was the kind of man who walked into any meeting with 3 versions of every argument already lined up in his head. He answered with an honesty that surprised him. "I don't know exactly. I thought if I came here I'd understand something." "Understand what?" "Why you disappeared." "Because one day you just weren't there anymore." Claire stayed quiet for a moment, then said, "I didn't disappear, Daniel. You left. You left to work, to build something. I never stopped writing." He looked at her, not fully understanding at first. "Writing letters. I mailed letters for almost 2 years until you stopped answering." Claire went completely still. Daniel felt something tighten in his chest. She said, her voice changing quality, no longer calm, now carrying something underneath it that was searching for room. "I never received a single letter." The two of them stared at each other. The silence that formed between them was different from every silence before it. It had shape, it took up space, it changed the temperature of the room. Daniel said slowly, "What? I never got a single letter from you. After you left, I waited. Every week I went to the post office in town. I did that for almost a year, until the day I stopped going, because I started to understand you'd decided not to write. But I did write, Daniel. I never received anything." He stood up from the chair, not out of anger, but a kind of physical disorientation, like the ground had been steady and suddenly wasn't. He stood in the middle of the small clapboard house in rural East Texas, 600 miles from the office where he'd built a whole life, and felt like something had flipped upside down. "I mailed letters for 2 years, Claire, addressed here to your parents' house. I asked for news. told you how I was doing, asked how you were. After a while with no answer, I called the landline twice. Nobody picked up, so I stopped. I figured you'd moved on." She was looking at him with an expression he'd never seen on her before, the look of someone reassembling an entire story with pieces that had never fit where she'd placed them. "I wrote to you too," she said. "I sent at least 20 letters to the address you left me. At first they wrote back saying you didn't live there anymore. Then I stopped sending because I didn't know where you were. But I always sent my new address. Sent it to whom?" Daniel opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "I mailed it to my mother with my new address, asking her to pass it along to you." Claire went so quiet that for a second Daniel thought he'd said something wrong. Then she said, "Your mother?" "Yes." Claire stood slowly, arms lightly crossed over her stomach, not defensively, but like she was holding something in that couldn't be spilled yet. "Wait here," she said. She went to the back room where she'd laid Lily down to sleep. She stayed a few minutes. Daniel heard the sound of something being moved, a drawer, a piece of furniture, then the muffled sound of something being pulled from under a bed or the back of a closet. When she returned, she carried a dark wooden box about the size of a shoebox, its lid held shut by a rubber band that had lost most of its stretch. She set it on the table in front of him and opened it. Inside were envelopes. Many envelopes, some opened, some not, all yellowed with age, some with bent corners, all carrying that particular smell of paper kept for years in a closed space. Daniel looked at the box, then at her. Claire said, "I found this after my mother died, in a box at the bottom of her closet. It took me a while before I could even open it, before I could read them." He picked up one of the envelopes carefully, recognized the handwriting before he even turned it over to check the sender. His handwriting, from when he was in his mid-20s, wider than now, with loops on the capital letters he'd long since lost. It was addressed to Claire Bennett at her parents' address, and it had been opened. He picked up another, same address, same handwriting, also opened. There were at least 30 or 40 envelopes in his handwriting. And there were other envelopes, these in a different hand, small and slanted to the right. Claire's handwriting, addressed to an apartment in Austin, he recognized as the first place he'd rented after he left. These were sealed, never opened, never sent. Daniel stared at the envelopes for a long time. The sun had shifted slightly, now coming through the window at a different angle, casting a band of yellow light across the table, across the box, across everything that had sat hidden there for more than a decade. "My mother," he said, and his voice didn't come out the way he expected. Lower, rougher. Claire sat down again. Her eyes were wet, but she wasn't crying. It was the kind of steadiness you learn when there's no one beside you for when you fall apart. "She never approved of you, you know that. She thought you'd leave and never come back, that I'd waste my life waiting on a man whose eyes were bigger than his heart. She thought you were too ambitious to settle for a simple life. But I was going to come back. I always said I'd come back once I'd built something. She knew that. She just didn't want to believe it." Daniel stared at the envelopes. "And when you found the letters, what did you feel?" Claire was quiet for a moment. Outside, a breeze passed and stirred the yellow-flowered vine on the gate. "I felt a lot of things. Anger at first. Anger at her. Anger at you. Anger at myself for spending all those years thinking you'd simply forgotten me. Then the anger faded and something else took its place." "What?" "Grief. For everything that didn't happen because of a choice neither of us made." Daniel leaned back in the chair. The open box sat in front of him with all that history of paper and ink and lost time, and he didn't know what to do with it. In 13 years, he'd learned to handle big problems. Corporate crises, difficult negotiations, partners who'd betrayed him, competitors who'd lied. He'd learned to turn obstacles into strategy, but there was no strategy for this. "Did you read the letters I wrote?" he asked. She nodded. "And the ones you wrote to me?" She glanced at the sealed envelopes. It took her a second to answer. "Some, not all. They were written in a very specific moment, and I needed time before I could reread them without—" She stopped. "Without what?" he asked quietly, careful not to press too hard. The silence came back, but different this time. Lighter but longer. The kind of silence that happens when two people are understanding the same thing at the same time. Daniel said, Can I read one? Claire looked at the sealed envelopes for a moment, then at him. You can read all of them if you want. They were written for you. He picked up an envelope, opened it carefully, as if the paper might tear. Inside were 2 sheets of notebook paper, written on both sides in that small slanted handwriting. He began to read. The letter was dated a month after he'd left. Claire wrote about her days, about the silence the house had taken on after he was gone, about how she'd started working at the pharmacy in town just to have something to do with her hands and hours. She wrote that Tom's father had asked about him one Sunday after church, and she'd said he was doing well, working, building something. She wrote that she was proud of that she was rooting for him to get everything he'd planned for, that she was okay, that she was waiting, that she missed him in a way that ached physically, like the absence of a person could turn into a pain in the body. Daniel folded the letter carefully and put it back in the envelope. He stared at the table for a moment, then looked at Claire and said, "Tell me about all of it, everything, from when I left." She looked at him for a moment, as if weighing whether this was truly what she wanted to do. Then she said, "It'll take a while. I have time." She got up and went to the kitchen, came back with 2 glasses of water, sat down again with her hands around the glass, and began to tell it. She told him that in the first year she'd worked at the pharmacy and lived with her parents, waiting, that she'd gone to the post office every week, like he'd said, and every week came back empty-handed with that feeling in her stomach that wasn't hunger. She'd held on to the certainty that there was some explanation, because she knew Daniel, knew his character, and the Daniel she knew wasn't the kind of man to promise and disappear. But the months passed, and the weekly trips to the post office became bi-weekly, then monthly, then stopped altogether. She told him her mother had started introducing her to sons of people she knew, with that subtlety that wasn't subtle at all, that particular kind of maternal engineering that never asks if the daughter wants to be engineered. She'd resisted for a while, then agreed to one dinner, then another, not out of interest, just because staring out the window had stopped being a bearable way to spend an evening. She'd met a man named Robert Hayes, a nurse's assistant, son of a shop owner in the next town over. Polite, decent, no obvious vices. He didn't make her feel anything close to what she'd felt for Daniel, but there was a tired kind of dignity in that, an honesty in the absence of any spark, something that could maybe be built with effort and patience instead of burning from the start. They'd stayed together 2 years. Daniel listened without moving a muscle in his face. Inside, there was something he preferred not to examine too closely. Claire went on. "It didn't work out. He was a good person, but I don't think either of us was really in it. We were being reasonable with each other, and reasonable isn't enough. We ended it without a fight, without drama. He moved to Austin. I stayed. My mother died 6 years ago, a heart attack in the middle of the night. She was 66. No warning at all." Daniel said quietly, "And when did you find the box?" "The week after the funeral. I was going through her things with my cousin's help, and at the bottom of the closet there was that wooden box. My cousin asked what it was. I said I didn't know. She accepted that and went to deal with something else. I sat there staring at the box for a long time before I opened it." "And when you did?" Claire took a breath. "I spent the whole afternoon reading. I sat there in her room on the bed reading letter after letter. When I finished, it was dark outside, and I hadn't even turned on the light. I sat there in the dark for I don't know how long." "What did you feel?" She looked down at her own fingers wrapped around the glass. "I felt like my mother loved me in her own way, the wrong way, the way that hurt a lot of things, but the only way she knew how. She was a woman who carried a lot of fear, and when she was afraid, she built walls. I grew up inside walls she built out of fear that I'd get hurt, and it hurt me a different way." Daniel said quietly, "Have you managed to forgive her?" Claire looked up at him. "I'm working on it. It's harder than it sounds, because sometimes I look at Lily and think about everything Lily could have had and didn't, and I get angry all over again. But then I remember Lily has what she has, and a lot of it is because of exactly who she has, and the anger passes." Daniel sat with that for a moment. Then he asked, "Lily, is her father around?" Claire lifted her eyes to him in a way that was too direct to be casual. "No," she said, and stopped there. Something in the way she said it made Daniel's breath catch for a second, like the air had shifted temperature. "Claire," he said. She looked at him. "Lily's 5. She didn't answer. 5 and a few months, he said, calculating out loud, more to himself than to her, like someone solving an equation and realizing the answer had been wrong the whole time. The silence that followed was different from every silence before it. It had a specific density, like the pressure in the air right before a storm. Claire set her glass down, folded her hands in her lap, and looked at him with an expression that wasn't calm anymore. It was courage, which is a different thing from calm because calm can be distance, and courage is always presence. "Daniel," she said. He looked at her. "Just over 5 years and 3 months ago, I had to go into Austin for some paperwork on the land I'd just inherited from my mother. I stayed 2 nights. You were in Austin around that same time, closing a deal. I knew because Tom mentioned it without meaning to in some conversation." Daniel went completely still. "I went to the hotel where you were staying. Not with any intention, I swear it wasn't planned. I just wanted to see you from a distance, understand what you'd become, understand if I still felt anything or if it had only ever been me," he said, his voice dropping even lower. "Did you see me? I went to the hotel bar. You were there. You saw me too." Daniel closed his eyes for a second because he remembered. There had been a night in Austin, a little over 5 years back. After a business dinner that had ended early, he'd gone down to the hotel bar without any particular plan, just because he didn't want to go up to his room yet. And there'd been a woman sitting at the far end of the bar who'd looked up when he walked in and recognized him before he recognized her. And when he did recognize her, something moved inside him with a force that wasn't anger and wasn't joy, but was so much of both that he'd stood frozen in the doorway for several seconds that felt much longer. Claire had spent that night with him. It hadn't been planned. It had been the kind of thing that happens when 2 pieces that belong together find each other again after too long apart, and neither one has it in them to be reasonable about it. In the morning when he woke, the room was quiet and she was gone. He'd lain there for a while staring at the ceiling, with the feeling that something important had happened without giving him time to understand what it was. Then he'd gotten up, showered, gone down to his meeting, and picked the life he'd built back up, carrying that night like one of those things that happen and you don't know what to do with them. But he'd thought about her. He'd tried, in the days after, to find a way to reach her. He'd asked Tom for her number, but Tom said he didn't have it, that he'd lost touch with her after she moved. And Daniel had let it go, because over the years he'd learned to let things go when they didn't have a clear path forward. Now he sat in a wooden chair in a clapboard house in rural East Texas, with a box of open letters in front of him, and the knowledge that a little girl was asleep behind a curtain of faded fabric, a girl who'd looked up at him with big, serious brown eyes he'd found familiar without knowing why, and now knew exactly why. "Claire," he said. She looked at him. "Is Lily my daughter?" It wasn't a question. Claire looked at him for a long moment. There was something in her eyes that was fear and resolve at the same time, the look of someone who built a fortress around something precious and is watching someone knock on the door. "Yes," she said. The word dropped into the silence of the room like a stone into water, small but sending out ripples. Daniel didn't move for a while. Then he stood. Not out of anger. The anger hadn't arrived yet, or maybe it never would, because what was inside him in that moment didn't carry the temperature of anger. It was something else, a weight and a clarity at the same time, like understanding you'd been carrying something you didn't know you were carrying. He walked to the window, stared out at the yard, at the clothesline with the small clothes, at the garden in the back, at the vine of yellow flowers. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked without turning around. Claire took a while to answer. "How was I supposed to tell you, Daniel? You'd vanished from my life. I had no way to find you. And when I found you that night in Austin, you woke up and left without leaving a number, without leaving anything. I took that as a message. I didn't leave as a message. I didn't know what to do. You'd already disappeared from my life years before that. No explanation. I didn't disappear. Your letters just never arrived." The two of them sat in silence. The weight of that night in Austin, which neither of them had really understood at the time, sat between them now with the full force of its consequence. Daniel spoke, still facing away. "When you found out you were pregnant, what did you do?" "I tried to find you. I looked you up, found the name of your company, a business address in New York. I mailed a letter. I don't know if it ever arrived." "Did it arrive?" he asked, turning around. She shook her head. "I don't know. I never got a response. After a while I stopped waiting. I had Lily and did what needed to be done. And it was hard," he said. "It wasn't a question, a statement, said with all the gentleness a statement can carry." Claire looked at him with a calm that had cost a great deal to build. It was what it was. Not easy, no, but Lily never went without what she needed. A lot of things might have been missing, but not the kind that can't be substituted. What she meant by that hung in the air. Daniel walked back to the chair and sat down again. He put his elbows on the table and his hands over his face for a moment, not to hide, but because sometimes hands are the only support available. Claire said with a gentleness in her voice he hadn't expected, "Daniel." He looked up. "I didn't tell you this to make you pay for anything. That's not what I needed you to understand." "What did you need me to understand?" She thought for a second, choosing her words instead of letting the first ones come out. "That we were sabotaged, not that you abandoned me and not that I ran off. We were kept apart by choices that weren't ours, and each of us was left holding the wrong version of what happened. I needed you to know that, not for me but for you, because I know you spent years carrying a version of events that wasn't true, just like I did." Daniel looked at her. There was something he needed to say and he wasn't finding the right shape for it. It wasn't an apology, because the wrong choices hadn't been his. It wasn't a declaration, because the moment wasn't right for that, and he wasn't the kind of man who made declarations without understanding the ground he was standing on. It was something closer to thank you for staying standing. Claire looked at him in a way he felt in his chest. "I didn't have another option," she said. "I had Lily." He nodded. The sun outside had shifted position. The afternoon was moving on. Behind the curtain, Lily slept with the stuffed rabbit. "Can I come back tomorrow?" Daniel asked. Claire was quiet for a moment. Not hesitation, consideration, which is different. "You can," she said. He nodded, stood from the chair, looked at the box of letters one last time. "Can I take the ones I wrote, just to reread them?" "They're yours. They always were." He picked up the box, then stopped. "And yours? The ones you wrote to me?" Claire glanced at the sealed envelopes, her own handwriting that had never reached its destination. "Those you can read here, if you want, next time." He nodded, walked to the door, stopped in the doorway and turned to her. "Claire, I know it doesn't help to say this now, but I need to. I never stopped thinking about you. Every one of these years, you were there, somewhere in the back, in a place I never knew what to do with." She looked at him for a moment, then said, "I know, I read the letters." And there was something in her voice in that moment that wasn't forgiveness, but stood right beside it. Something that was possibility, which is sometimes the most frightening and the most necessary thing there is. Daniel left, walked to the car with the box under his arm. The vine of yellow flowers stirred slightly as he passed through the gate. The sun was dropping behind the trees at the edge of the field, painting the sky the kind of orange the countryside does better than any city ever could. He got in the car, set the box on the passenger seat, stared at it for a moment and then began to cry. Not the loud kind with noise and gesture, the quiet kind that doesn't announce itself, that starts in the eyes and runs down the face while the rest of the body stays perfectly still, as if the emotion knows the body needs time to catch up to what's happening. He cried for everything he'd judged as abandonment that had actually been sabotage. He cried for the year Claire spent walking to the post office every week and coming home empty-handed. He cried for the sealed letters that were never sent. He cried for that night in Austin, which he'd walked away from thinking it was an ending when it was a beginning. He cried for a 5-year-old girl with a stuffed rabbit who'd looked at him with eyes that were his own. He cried until his throat tightened and his eyes burned and the orange sky turned purple. Then he took a breath, wiped his face with the back of his hand, started the engine, and before pulling away, looked one last time at the house. He saw the light come on behind the window. He saw Claire's shadow moving inside. He drove back to the hotel with the box on the passenger seat and the certainty that something had shifted that afternoon in a way that couldn't be undone. That night, in the hotel room with the air conditioning humming and the quiet of a small town outside, Daniel opened the box and started reading. He began with his own letters in order by date. The first had been written 3 weeks after he'd left, still from Austin, from a one-bedroom apartment he shared with a co-worker. The handwriting was livelier than it would become later, full of the enthusiasm of someone just starting out who believes everything is going to work. He wrote about the city, about the new job at a logistics company where he'd landed an analyst position, about the small apartment that was his alone, about plans that were still sketches but already had shape. And he asked about her, how she was doing, what she'd done that weekend, whether the summer festival at the town square had been good that year, whether old Mr. Coleman had finally fixed the barn roof. He asked with that kind of specific detail that only makes sense when you know someone's life well and want to keep knowing it, even from far away. The second letter, a month later, carried the same tone, but with a sharper edge of anxiety that hadn't been in the first. It said he'd been waiting for a reply and figured maybe the mail out in the country was just slow. It said he was doing fine, had gotten a small promotion, that it was a start, and that he was saving up for when he came back. The third showed a subtle but present shift. The anxiety had grown. He wrote that he'd sent 2 letters with no answer and was starting to worry, that if she was okay, 1 line would be enough, that he'd understand if she was busy, but he needed to know she was all right. And so it went, letter after letter, the narrative of a man building a story out of the absence of an answer, offering a new explanation with every letter. Maybe the mail. Maybe she was caring for a sick parent. Maybe something had happened. Maybe she was just working too much. And with every letter, the alternate explanation lost a little more strength, replaced by one Daniel had avoided naming until a certain letter, the 13th, written in a tone that had turned dry and controlled, the voice of a man trying not to show he was hurting. Claire, I don't know what to think anymore. I've written so many times and never heard back. I'm going to call your family's number next week. If that doesn't work either, I'll understand you've made your decision, and I need to respect that, even without understanding it. But know that I'm still here. Daniel folded that letter and stared at the ceiling. He had called twice, just like he'd told Claire. The first time, no one answered. The second time, a voice he didn't recognize said Claire wasn't home and offered to take a message. He'd left his cell number. Never got a call back. It had been Claire's mother who answered. He understood that now. 13 years too late. He kept reading. The last letter was dated 2 years after he'd left. The tone was different from everything before it. No more anxiety, no more alternate explanations. Just a brevity that belonged to someone who'd already processed the pain and come out the other side with a kind of peace that costs a great deal. Claire, I won't write again after this one. You made your choice and I need to respect it. I just want you to know you were real to me, that I never treated what we had as something temporary, something you outgrow. I hope you're doing well. I hope you found what you needed, and if you ever want to know how I'm doing, I'll be here. Daniel folded the letter, put it back, lay in the dark for a long time, the box on the nightstand, the hotel silent around him, and thought, with the kind of clarity that only comes when something twisted finally straightens out, that he'd spent 13 years building an answer to a question that had never actually been asked correctly. He'd built the company, the fortune, the reputation, the apartment with the view, the ranch he never visited, the calendar packed with meetings, the life that from the outside looked exactly like what he'd said he wanted to be when he was young, and stared past the fence of his father's farm believing that real things happened out there. All of it built, at bottom, in answer to a woman he'd assumed had chosen to stay, who had stayed, but not the way he'd imagined. Alone in a clapboard house, raising a 5-year-old who looked at the world with his eyes. He slept little that night. The next morning, before heading to the courthouse to finish the paperwork on his father's land, he stopped at a grocery store and bought a few things. Not a long list. Milk, coffee, sugar, rice, beans, some fruit, a block of cheese, and in the toy aisle, he stood for a while before choosing an illustrated storybook with a sunflower on the cover and a fresh box of crayons. He didn't think too hard about what he was doing. Sometimes thinking too hard is just a way of not doing. He finished the paperwork at the courthouse by 11 that morning. He ate lunch alone in a corner booth at a diner in town, watching people come and go with their lives. There was something about the pace of small-town life that a big city didn't have, a different rhythm, a way time had of passing without the constant urgency New York demanded. He'd left this place determined to escape that rhythm, believing it was laziness or resignation. Now, at 43, with a box of letters on the passenger seat, he thought he'd had it backward. By 2 in the afternoon, he was back on Hollow Creek Road. The gate was open this time. He drove the car slowly into the yard and stopped. Before he got out, he heard sound coming from behind the house, a child's voice, loud and unconcerned with volume, and a woman's voice answering with the particular patience of a mother who said the same thing several times already and is willing to say it again. He got out with the grocery bags, walked around to the back. Claire was kneeling in the garden, dirt on her hands, pulling weeds from between the collared rows. Lily was beside her with a small red plastic bucket, helping in a way that probably slowed things down more than it sped them up. But Claire let it happen with the generosity of someone who knows the effort matters more than the result. The girl saw Daniel first, stared at him for a second with that same default seriousness. Then she said, "Mum, the man's back." Claire turned, saw him, saw the bags. "Brought some things," Daniel said, a little awkward. "Hope that's not overstepping." She looked at the bags for a moment. Something crossed her face that lasted less than a second. An emotion she didn't let finish before reining it in. But Daniel saw it. "Didn't need to," she said. "I know," he said. "But I wanted to." She wiped her hands on the rag tucked into her waistband. "Stand up already? Go put it in the kitchen then," she said, "and grab some water from the fridge. It's hot out here." Daniel smiled. It was the first real smile he'd had since arriving in that town. He went in, set the bags down, grabbed the water, came back out and stood drinking it, watching Claire and Lily in the garden. The girl had abandoned her bucket and was now chasing a butterfly between the rows of collards with total, focused seriousness. The kind of full-body purpose kids bring to the smallest things, the kind adults lose somewhere along the way and spend the rest of their lives trying to get back without quite knowing that's what they're looking for. Claire came and stood beside him. The two of them watched Lily for a moment. Daniel asked quietly, "How are you going to explain it to her?" Claire thought for a second. "When she's old enough to understand with the truth that her father is a man I loved very much and things didn't happen the way they could have, but that he exists, and she can know him." "And if he wants to be part of things?" Daniel asked, not taking his eyes off Lily. Claire turned her head slightly toward him. He met her look. "I want to be part of things, Claire. I don't know how yet. I don't know the right shape for it, but I want to." She looked at him for a stretch of time longer than it took to understand what he'd said. The kind of time it takes to weigh whether something is true, to measure, with whatever instinct a person develops after enough life, whether there's substance behind the words or just intention. Then she said, "Then we'll figure it out." Lily had caught the butterfly in her cupped hands and was examining it through the gaps in her fingers with the expression of a scientist making an important discovery. Then she opened her hands slowly and let it go, watching it rise until it disappeared into the sky. She turned to the two adults and announced, with the tone of someone presenting a logical conclusion, "She went away, but she'll come back, 'cause there's flowers here." Claire let out a soft laugh. Daniel looked at the girl and felt something without an exact name, something that had shadowed him for 13 years in the shape of an absence, and now, suddenly, had filling. That evening, the three of them stayed in the yard as the sun went down. Claire showed Daniel the garden, and he asked about the planting with an attention that wasn't politeness, but genuine interest. He'd grown up on a farm, knew the land, had forgotten how good it felt to talk about it, in terms that weren't market value per acre or investment potential. At some point, Lily decided Daniel was trustworthy enough to be introduced to the stuffed rabbit whose name was Buster, and informed him, with the full seriousness of someone passing along important intelligence, that Buster was old and needed careful handling because his stuffing was coming out of one arm. Daniel examined Buster with all the gravity the situation demanded and confirmed that indeed the stuffing was coming out, and Buster needed medical attention. Lily approved of the diagnosis. When the sun had nearly disappeared, Claire said she'd start dinner. Daniel offered to help. She gave him the kind of look that measures whether an offer is politeness or sincerity. "You know how to peel potatoes?" she asked. "I do," he said. "Grew up doing it." "All right then." They stood in the small kitchen that smelled of wood smoke and cilantro. Lily perched on a stool watching the two of them, with the attention of someone observing something she doesn't fully understand, but senses is important. The battery radio played low, tuned to a country station full of old songs, the kind Daniel's grandfather used to play on the porch on festival nights. Daniel peeled potatoes. Claire made the stock. They cut vegetables from the garden. She seasoned by feel, the way a country cook does, no measuring, just knowing by smell and color when it's right. While they worked, they didn't talk about the letters or Austin or the 13 years or what would need to be decided. They talked about small, real things. Daniel's father's ranch, sold off in pieces over the years. About Tom Bradley, who'd married the daughter of the hardware store owner and had 3 kids and raised cattle now. About how the town had gotten a second stoplight and a home improvement store everybody assumed wouldn't last and was doing just fine. It was a conversation that hadn't existed for 13 years, and yet somehow sounded for reasons that weren't easy to name, like the continuation of something interrupted midway, not the start of something new. They ate dinner, the 3 of them, at the table with its 3 mismatched chairs, the jar of wildflowers in the middle, the radio humming low in the background. Lily ate with the seriousness of someone who has a serious relationship with food, gave her opinion that the stew was good but could use more potatoes, and Claire said next time she'd be in charge of the potatoes. After dinner, Claire said she'd get Lily bathed and to bed. Daniel stayed at the table with a glass of water in front of him. He listened to the sounds coming from the bathroom. Lily's high voice complaining the water was cold, Claire insisting it was plenty warm, the splash of water a bit of singing. There was something in it that was the exact opposite of the apartment back in Manhattan. That apartment was quiet with the quality of something undisturbed. This house was quiet with the quality of a pause, the silence of someone who just finished making noise and is about to make more soon. Claire came back about 20 minutes later. She said Lily had asked for the rabbit story before bed, and it had taken a while because the rabbit in the story met a new friend and they went on an adventure. She sat down again. They stayed quiet for a while, but not uncomfortably. It was the silence of 2 people who've already said enough for one day but still have plenty left to say, and don't need to say it all at once. Daniel said, "Eventually I have to head back to New York, day after tomorrow." Claire nodded. "And then?" "I don't know exactly what and then looks like yet, but I'm not leaving things the way they were." She looked at him. "I want to be part of Lily's life, for real, not from a distance, not sending money and showing up once a year. Present." Claire went quiet. Daniel went on, "And I know we still have a lot to work out, that I can't show up here after 13 years with my hands full of certainties, like nothing ever happened. That's not what I'm saying." "Then what are you saying?" "That I want the chance to find out what's still there between us, slowly, without pressure, in whatever way makes sense to you. But I don't want to leave it unresolved anymore." Claire looked at him for a long time. There was a stillness in her hands on the table that belonged to someone genuinely thinking it through, not someone who'd already made up her mind and was waiting for the right moment to say it. "Daniel, you have a whole life built in New York, a big life with weight, with obligations." "I do. And I have a life built here, small but mine. I'm not interested in being something you fit into your calendar when you can. That's not what I'm asking." "Then what are you asking?" He thought for a second. "That you don't shut the door before we find out what's on the other side of it." The silence that followed had an answer inside it. The answer just wasn't ready to be said out loud yet. Claire said, "Go on and get some sleep, Daniel. You coming back tomorrow?" "I am." "Then tomorrow we keep going." He stood, took the glass to the sink and washed it before leaving, because that was the kind of thing you did when you wanted to show you understood the difference between visiting and belonging. He said goodnight. He walked out to the gate, stopped once, turned around. The living room window had a light on. He saw Claire's shadow moving inside. He kept walking. That night at the hotel, he read the letters Claire had written to him. They were different from his, denser, more internal, the kind of writing that happens when someone is thinking on the page instead of just reporting events. There was a letter written in the middle of the night, clearly during a sleepless hour, the handwriting more uneven than usual, where she wrote about fear. Not fear of him, not fear of being abandoned, but the fear that comes with loving someone in a way that gives them the power to make or unmake you, and not knowing whether handing that kind of power to another person is wisdom or madness. There was a letter written after they'd stopped dating, from before they separated, from a time when he was starting to talk about leaving, and she was starting to understand he was really going to. That letter was about what she'd wanted to say and hadn't, that she'd wanted to come with him, that she'd stayed quiet because she believed if he wanted her to come, he would ask, that she'd waited for the invitation and it never came, and she'd read that as a sign he didn't want her along, and had stayed quiet so she wouldn't have to hear in words what she'd already understood in silence. Daniel stared at that letter for a long time. He had left believing she'd chosen to stay. She had stayed believing he'd chosen to leave without her. 13 years of misunderstanding, rooted in a silence neither of them had dared break at the right moment. There was one last letter, the most recent, dated only 8 months earlier. It had been written after Claire read all the other letters in the box. His. The handwriting was steady and deliberate, like someone who came to the page with intention. Daniel, I don't know if you'll ever read this. Probably not. But I need to write it because if I don't, it stays inside and it gets heavy. I read your letters and cried for days. Cried for everything you felt without me knowing. For everything I felt without you knowing. For everything that never happened because someone decided it shouldn't. I'm not angry at my mother anymore. I've learned that carrying anger at someone who's gone is a weight you carry alone. But I'm sad. Sad for a version of us that existed in letters and memory, but never had the chance to exist in the real world. You built a big life. I built a life that fits inside a small house. I don't know if those two lives are the same size, but I know Lily has your eyes, and every time she looks at me, I remember there's a version of you still out there in the world, and that's a good thing. Take care of yourself. Claire. Daniel folded the letter, held it by the edges for a moment, staring at her name at the bottom, that capital C with the extra flourish at the start, a habit of her handwriting he'd already memorized without meaning to, 30 letters back. He put it in the envelope, back in the box, turned off the light and lay in the dark, more awake than he'd been in a long time, understanding that there were two versions of a life, the kind you build with plans and effort and strategy, which results in companies and penthouses with a view and bank accounts and full calendars, and the kind you build with presence and choice and staying, which results in a garden and a stuffed rabbit and children who let butterflies go because they know they'll come back where there are flowers. He'd built plenty of the first kind. He hadn't built any of the second. The next morning he came back early, so early Lily was still in her pajamas when he arrived, hair uncombed, Buster tucked under one arm. Claire was making coffee. She looked at him as he came through the door with an expression that carried a soft kind of humor, as if to say, this early. Brought donuts from the bakery that just opened by the square, he said. Come in, all three of us will have coffee, she said. Lily studied Daniel with the attention she'd been applying to him since the very first moment, the seriousness of a child forming an opinion based on evidence. She ate 2 donuts and declared them good, which Daniel understood as approval. After coffee, Claire said she was heading into town for a few things. She told Daniel he could come along if he wanted, or stay, that Lily would be home. Daniel said he'd stay. Claire gave him that quick, appraising look. She won't give you trouble, she said, but she's stubborn when she doesn't get her way. Takes after her mother, he said without thinking. Claire gave him that almost smile that wasn't quite a smile, but was better than one, and left. Daniel was alone with Lily for the first time. The girl watched him for a moment, holding Buster. Then she walked to the shelf, pulled out a thick storybook with a worn cover, brought it over, and set it in his lap without a word, with the natural ease of a child who doesn't ask for what she needs, because she hasn't yet learned that adults sometimes need to be asked. Daniel opened the book. It was a collection of American folk tales, with colorful illustrations of Paul Bunyan and Brer Rabbit, and the Headless Horseman. Lily climbed onto the stool next to him and leaned against his arm with the easy freedom of a child who hasn't developed the concept of personal space with adults. She's already decided to trust. He started reading. He read for almost an hour, story after story, his voice shifting for each character, growing more dramatic as Lily kept demanding he redo the monster voices. She commented throughout with observations that revealed a surprisingly coherent internal logic. She said the trickster in one story was mischievous, but not mean, and that those were two different things. She said the woodsman in another story protected the animals, and that was good of him, but he could have given a warning instead of scaring people. Daniel agreed that scaring people without warning wasn't very nice. When Claire got back, she found the two of them on the living room bench, Lily asleep with her head on Daniel's arm, the book open on his lap. She stood in the doorway a moment, watching. Daniel looked up at her over the book. There was something on her face in that moment he'd never seen before. Not in all their years together, not in the letters, not in the memories he'd carried for 13 years. It was an expression that held love, but not only love. It held the recognition of something she'd waited a long time to see. She came in slowly, so as not to wake the girl, went to the kitchen. Daniel stayed still until Lily stirred and woke with the disorientation of a child who doesn't know for a second where she is, then remembers and settles. She looked at him, then at her mother in the kitchen, then back at him and said, still thick with sleep, "Are you leaving today?" Daniel looked at her. "Today I am. But I'll be back." Lily considered this for a moment. Then she said, "You can bring Buster a friend when you come back. He's never had one." Daniel said he would. She accepted that as a done deal and slid off the bench to go find her mother in the kitchen. Late that afternoon, before leaving for good, Daniel stood in the yard with Claire while the sun put on that last performance of orange and purple the countryside does with a generosity no city can match. "I'll take care of everything back in New York. Contracts, my calendar, some things I can't leave hanging. But I want to come back in a month." She said, "A month." Not as surprise, not as objection, as confirmation. He asked, "What do you need here, Claire? Not from me as a man, just practically. The roof, the house, whatever you need." She was quiet for a second, then said, "You don't need to fix me, Daniel." "That's not fixing. That's taking care of. Different thing." She looked at him, said, "The roof's got a shingle missing on the left side, leaks bad when it rains hard, and the water pump's making a noise it shouldn't." He nodded. "I'll send someone I trust to look at it this week." She started to say something and didn't. He understood there was a difference between accepting help and being overrun, and that Claire had built her whole life inside that distinction at great cost. "Not as charity," he said, "as responsibility. Mine, long before I knew it was." She accepted that framing. They stood in silence for a moment, side by side, watching the field go gold in the fading light. Daniel said, "Claire." "I want to apologize. Not for what wasn't my fault, not for the letters, but for leaving without making sure you were coming with me, for assuming staying was your choice when it was my failure to ask." She was quiet for a long stretch, but it wasn't empty. Then she said, "And me for staying quiet waiting for the invitation instead of saying I wanted to go." They both looked out at the field. Then Claire said quietly, with a humor that was sad and warm at once, "We were pretty stupid." Daniel laughed, a real laugh, short, from the right place. "Were we?" She laughed too, small, but hers. The sun disappeared. Daniel walked to the car, put on his seatbelt, sat a second with his hands on the wheel, then went back to the gate where Claire stood, with her hand on the old wood, and said, "Is there a way to call you? A number that's yours?" She gave him the number for a simple cell phone she used for calls. He saved it. "I'll call this week just to check in." She nodded. He left. But unlike every other time he'd driven away from that land, this time it wasn't with the feeling of leaving something behind. It was with the feeling of leaving something he was going to find again. The weeks that followed in New York were different from every week before them. Not in appearance. The calendar stayed full. The meetings kept happening. The reports kept landing in his inbox at 7 in the morning. Decisions kept getting made at the pace the job demanded. On the surface, Daniel Whitfield was the same man he'd been before East Texas. Underneath, something had recalibrated. Things that used to take up a lot of space had shrunk. The dinner with the overseas partner that would supposedly define the next decade of the partnership became simply a dinner with a partner about a deal. The penthouse with the view became just an apartment with a view, without the symbolic weight it had carried for years as proof he'd arrived somewhere. He called Claire that Wednesday like he'd promised. She picked up with the sound of the countryside behind her voice, wind and birdsong, and he found himself just listening for a second before he spoke. "Hey," he said. "Hey," she said. And there was, in those two words traded between a Manhattan apartment and a clapboard house in East Texas, an absurd amount packed into syllables that small, and it was there just the same. They talked for almost an hour about nothing in particular. She told him Lily had brought home an award-winning drawing from school, a family portrait that consisted of Claire, Lily, Buster, and a hen named Henrietta, who lived in the yard. He told her he'd finally closed a deal that had seemed impossible when it started, years in the making. "You sound tired," she said. He was surprised. "You can hear that." "In your voice, yeah." He thought about it. "I am, but it's a different kind of tired than before. Before I'd get tired and get angry. Now I just get tired." "That's healthier," she said. "I think so." There was a good pause. Then she said, "The guy came about the roof, fixed the shingles. It's good now." "Good. You sent more than it needed." "I sent what it needed." "Daniel." Silence, 2 seconds. She said, with the tone of someone making an exception, "Thank you." "You're welcome." They talked a while longer. Before hanging up, Lily appeared somewhere in the middle of the call and announced to the phone that Buster was waiting for his friend, and it was best not to take too long. Daniel said Buster's friend was already on the way. He went back to East Texas 3 weeks later. Not a month, 3 weeks, because he'd rearranged his calendar more aggressively than he'd planned. He arrived on a Friday afternoon with a small suitcase. He'd booked a room at a bed and breakfast in town instead of the hotel on the far side, which was pricier and farther away. The place was simple, with a ceiling fan that squeaked and a yard with an old garden hose, and breakfast came off a wood stove, and Daniel ate with more appetite than he'd had in years. He spent the whole weekend at Claire's house. On Saturday, he helped Frank Coleman fix the water pump with the strange noise. Frank was a man in his 70s, lean in body and in words, who looked Daniel over when he arrived with the look of someone who'd heard things and was checking whether they matched up. The two of them crouched around the pump for a good while, Claire appearing at the window now and then to check on their progress. At some point, Frank said, without taking his eyes off the pump, "That girl and that child been through a lot on their own." Daniel said, "I know." Frank said, "Now you do." And he didn't say anything more on the subject, but there was, in the inflection, in the tone of the silence that followed, the clear sense that everything that needed saying had been said. The pump got fixed. On Sunday, Claire made lunch for the three of them, a pot roast with cornbread that filled the house with a smell Daniel hadn't caught since childhood, when his grandmother used to cook it for the holidays. Lily hung around the kitchen, asking a stream of questions Claire answered with the patience of someone who'd answered them before and would answer them again. Daniel peeled potatoes again. He'd become, he realized, this kitchen's default hand for that job. And there was something absurdly right about it. Sunday afternoon, after lunch, Claire and Daniel sat in the shade of an old oak at the back of the property while Lily played with Henrietta the hen, with a seriousness of purpose the hen didn't seem to share, but tolerated with patience. Claire said, "You're not going to be able to keep coming out here all the time. I'll rearrange whatever needs rearranging." She looked at him. "Daniel, I don't want you building half a life in 2 places just to be near. That doesn't work for anybody." "I know. That's why I want to talk to you about something." She waited. "I'm thinking about opening a regional office in Austin. I've put it off for years because there was never a good enough reason. Now, well..." Claire went quiet. He went on. "I'm not saying I'm moving tomorrow. I'm saying I'm thinking about building a structure that lets me be here more, if that makes sense." And if it doesn't work out between us? Not defensively, directly. Then I've still got a regional office in Austin and a daughter nearby, he said, which is already more than I had. She looked out at the field for a moment. You've changed. I'm trying to. I'm not saying it changed in a bad way. I'm saying you got more like who I thought you were going to be. He sat with that for a second. What version of me did you think I was going to be? She thought about it. Someone who knows big things are sometimes smaller than the small ones. You had that in you, but it was buried under a lot of ambition. I don't think it went anywhere. It just stayed buried a long time. Daniel looked out at the field, at Henrietta escaping Lily in a way that clearly wasn't a real escape, at the vine of yellow flowers that now wrapped around the side of the house too. Claire, I want to build something real with you. I'm not in a hurry. It doesn't have to be now. It doesn't need a shape yet. But I want you to know that's what I want. She was quiet for a while, then said, Give me time. How much time do you need? She gave him that almost smile, worth more than most things he'd received in his life. I don't know, but give it to me. I'm here, he said. And in those 2 words, spoken by a man who'd spent 13 years somewhere else, there was a promise that carried the weight of truth, precisely because it no longer had the ease of a beginning. It carried the difficulty of someone who understood what he'd lost, and was choosing again with that understanding intact. The afternoon passed. The sun went. The stars over the countryside, without the competition of city light, came out in numbers. New York never let you see. Lily fell asleep in Claire's lap under the tree, Henrietta dozing beside her like family, which in a way she was. The 2 adults sat in silence, looking up at the sky. At some point Claire said, Do you know the stars? A little. My grandfather taught me. My mother taught me too. Whatever else she got wrong, she knew the constellations. There was a pause. It's funny what you keep of people after they're gone, Claire said. Funny how you expect to hold on to the big things, the important moments, but what stays is the small stuff. The way someone made coffee, the names of the stars, how they folded a dish towel. Daniel looked up at the sky. What did you keep of her that you didn't expect to keep? Claire was quiet for a second. The way she hummed while she swept, she sang low, off-key, wrong in every way, but she sang. Sometimes I catch Lily watching me sweep and realize I'm humming the exact same way. The silence that followed had texture, not the absence of something, but the presence of something that didn't need words. Daniel left late. Lily had woken briefly to say goodnight and check that he knew where Buster's new friend was in the suitcase, and once he confirmed it, she went back to sleep, satisfied the protocol had been followed. At the gate, Claire said, When are you coming back? Next week, if I can. She nodded. He walked back down the dirt road with the window down in the last days of September, the smell of dry grass and earth and country night filling the car. And he thought there was a version of his life that had gone by entirely without this, and it had been a very successful life and a very incomplete one. The months that followed were construction, not the fast kind, not the kind with ribbon cuttings and press photos, but the kind built brick by brick, conversation by conversation, weekend by weekend, the kind that sometimes moves forward and sometimes doesn't, and the times it doesn't teach you just as much as the times it does. Daniel opened the Austin office. It took 4 months. It was more complicated than he'd expected. He hit resistance from 2 partners who thought it was an emotional decision, which was true but wasn't a problem, because the best decisions he'd made in his life had always had emotion as a component. He started making the trip out to East Texas every week, or every other week, depending on his schedule. He got to know Frank Coleman better, who over time moved from that appraising look to the kind of quiet, practical hospitality that is a certain generation of men's version of affection. He met Frank's neighbor, Ruth Coleman, who went from suspicious to warm in exactly 3 visits, and after that started sending over a jar of homemade preserves every time Daniel showed up, which he came to understand as the local version of approval. He got to know Lily better. That happened slowly, the way it happens when you don't force it, when you let the child set the pace, because children know, with an instinct adults lose, exactly how much of someone they want at a time. There were Sundays when Lily ignored him completely in favor of Buster, Henrietta, and some elaborate operation involving sticks and rocks she called building a city, with an internal logic that was impossible to follow. There were afternoons when she clung to him with the ease of a child who's decided you're trustworthy, climbed into his lap, demanded the story, gave notes on the monster voices. There was an afternoon, about 3 months after that first visit, when Lily was drawing at the table and without looking up said, "Mum said you're my dad." Daniel went quiet for a second. "That's right." The girl kept drawing for a moment. Then she said, "But you lived far away." "I did, but now I'm going to be closer." She considered that with her crayon in hand. "Ben from school has a dad who lives far away, and he only sees him on vacation. I'm going to come more than that, more than vacations." She looked at him for the first time since the conversation started. "How much more?" Every week I can, and when I can't, the week after that." She looked at him with those eyes that were his, but carried all of Claire inside them. Then she said okay and went back to her drawing. And there was, in that simple acceptance, no drama, no ceremony, just okay, more than anything that had happened in the last several months. Something that made Daniel need to take a breath before he could say anything else. With Claire, things moved slower. Not because she was being difficult, but because she was being careful, which is the way of someone who's been genuinely hurt and learned the difference between courage and recklessness. There were nights they sat on the porch he'd had rebuilt for her with Frank's help, old wood and a tin roof, and talked for hours about everything and nothing. There were days when the distance between them was tangible, not coldness but process. Two people learning how to occupy each other's space again without trampling what had been built in the absence. There was one night of hard rain, months later, when Daniel stayed because the road had become impassable. Lily had gone to bed early, worn out from carrying her little red bucket around outside, trying to collect rain for reasons she knew and didn't share. The two adults stayed up in the small living room, the rain drumming on the roof, a candle lit because the power had gone out, and they talked for hours with that quality only rain can bring to a conversation. At some point Claire asked, "Are you afraid of anything?" He thought about it honestly. Of doing it again, of making a decision that feels right and hurting someone who doesn't deserve it. "You didn't make a wrong decision," she said. "You left without the right information. I could have pushed harder to get the right information too." She was quiet for a second, then said, "We've already been down the road of blaming ourselves for what we could have done differently. It doesn't take us anywhere good." "Are you afraid of anything?" he asked. "Of believing too much too soon," she said. "Of letting Lily get attached and then having to explain an absence. I'm not going to disappear. You don't know what's going to happen. I know I'm not going to disappear on purpose. The rest I don't know, but that much I know." She looked at the candle for a while, then said, "I know you wouldn't disappear on purpose. It's just that sometimes life disappears people, whether they mean it to or not." He understood what she meant. "I know. But as long as I have a choice, I'm choosing to be here." The silence that came after carried the rain in it. That night, for the first time since Austin more than 5 years earlier, Claire let Daniel stay. Not in a settled way, not with a declaration or a definition, but the way it happens between two people who've known each other a long time, who suffered apart for a long time, and who finally find themselves in the same room with the rain outside and no rush to name what they're building. In the morning the rain had passed. The sun came in sideways through the window and lit up the table, the wildflowers always fresh, because Claire replaced them the moment they wilted. Lily woke up, found the two of them in the kitchen making coffee, and said with the blunt logic of a child processing new information, "You stayed." "I did," Daniel said. She thought about it. "You can stay more." Claire looked at her daughter with an expression that held too much love to fit into a single glance. "I'm going to," Daniel said. Lily accepted that. She grabbed Buster from the chair where she'd left him the night before and went to sit in the doorway to watch the yard after the rain, with the seriousness of someone who has a lot to take in from that freshly washed landscape. The two adults stood quietly in the kitchen. Then Claire said, with that almost smile Daniel had learned to read better than any full expression on anyone else's face, "Coffee's ready." "Thank you," he said. And there was in that thank you more than just the coffee, more than the night of rain, more than the months before it of visits and conversations and patience and rebuilding. There was the recognition of everything that had led there, the letters that never got delivered, the letters that were intercepted, a woman who'd built a house with her own hands and raised a daughter alone and held on to her dignity when it would have been easier not to. A little girl with a stuffed rabbit who'd looked at a stranger with serious eyes and decided he was trustworthy. 13 years of a story that had been told wrong to both of them and was finally being retold with the right information. And a man who'd built a fortune and discovered the most valuable thing he had was in a small house at the end of a country road, waiting. Not for him, but for the chance to be found again. Daniel picked up his cup of coffee, stood in the small kitchen with the smell of wood smoke and cilantro and morning after rain. In the doorway, Lily watched the yard with her usual seriousness. Claire stood beside him, cup in hand. Outside, the butterfly was back on the vine of yellow flowers, because there were flowers there, and sometimes that's exactly it. Not the grand gesture, not the dramatic declaration, not the money that solves everything money never actually solves. Sometimes it's the coffee after the rain, and the child in the doorway and the woman beside you, and the understanding that you've arrived exactly where you needed to be. Not by the road you'd planned, but by the only road that could have ever led here. And that was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. If you made it all the way to the end, thank you truly for staying with this story. If it touched your heart in some way, if it made you think, if it moved you, then do what you can for us. Subscribe to the channel right now, like this video, hit the notification bell so you don't miss the next story, and drop a comment below letting us know where you're watching from. Every comment, every like, every new subscriber helps this channel grow and lets us keep bringing you stories just like this one. See you in the next one.